Hello, History 362. So this week we're going to be talking about the Antigonid kings of Macedonia, the dynasty established by Antigonus Gonatas in the 270s, or you could say reestablished, given that his father Demetrius Poliorcetes had briefly ruled Macedonia in the 290s BC. And then this dynasty endures down to 168 BC, when the last king Perseus is overthrown by Rome. Now, as with the Seleucids and then also the Ptolemies, for these 3 weeks, we're just going to be looking at these kingdoms down to 200 BC. That is, down to the point that before the big confrontations with Rome really start to change how the kind of geopolitics of the Eastern Mediterranean works. So the Antigonids of Macedonia, I would say, are kind of unusual in 2 ways compared to their counterparts in Antioch, the Seleucids, and Alexandria, the Ptolemies. One obvious way that they're different is that the Antigonids actually are native kings ruling over an ancestral homeland. And indeed, so this is an ethnic kingship. And this somewhat differs from the kind of kingship that the Seleucids and the Ptolemies embody, where they basically say, hey, look, we are ruling over Spear One land, or Ktetos Ge, and therefore we simply rule because we are mighty. The kings of Macedonia basically claim to rule because they are Macedonian, ruling over Macedonians. And so this is actually a real advantage that the Antigonid kings have, is that when your only claim to rule is that you're a warlord, that you're able to dominate Spear One land, that creates a bit of a fragile legitimacy, right? There's, no one likes to be told the only reason that the person ruling them is through kind of a might makes right. Antigonid kings, however, while they do rule over regions that they've conquered and exert hegemony, we'll talk about that, the core territory that they rule over, Macedonia, they claim to rule simply as the dynasty, the ruling dynasty. And indeed, we have inscriptions that talk about the Basileus Kai Macedones, the king and the Macedonian, sort of seen as a pair. So this fact of ethnic kingship, I think, really does give the Antigonids a lot more legitimacy, at least in their homeland. Whereas the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, they have legitimacy, a lot of legitimacy over the kind of clerics and the settlers, the Greco-Macedonian population, who need the kings to ensure their right to rule their plots. But the Macedonians, again, are ruling, again, a kind of ethnic homeland. So this is one advantage that the Macedonian kings have. There is a disadvantage, however, in terms of really every kind of metric of state power. The Macedonian kings are weaker than their counterparts in the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemaic kingdom. Their tax base is quite likely much, much lower. Their natural resource base is much, much lower. And their manpower base is much, much smaller. And if we sort of, again, there's no question that there's 3 great powers in this system. But the Antigonids are definitely the weakest great power. Of course, you might say, well, what does it sort of mean to be a great power? My personal definition is that great powers can existentially threaten other smaller states. They can threaten each other. But smaller states that aren't great powers, don't have the capacity to existentially threaten a great power. And I think that's basically right, that Macedonia, while it has the capacity to existentially threaten Athens or Sparta, it does not have, Athens or Sparta or the Achaean League or the Ptolemaic don't have the capacity to existentially threaten Macedonia. So in that way, it's still much, much larger and still much more powerful than the other smaller states in Greece. But that said, compared to the size, the population, the wealth of the Seleucid kingdom, the extraordinary wealth of Egypt, the Macedonian king is definitely in a lower kind of weight class amongst these 3 big powers. Now, how do Macedonian kings get their resources? Well, a key element, and this was true for Philip II when we talked about Philip II. A key element of Macedonian power is natural resource exploitation. So Macedonia has a lot of timber that is under royal control, and Macedonia also has mineral resources, especially precious minerals, in the mines that are kind of to the north of Amphipolis. And so control over silver and gold mining especially brings in a lot of revenue to the Macedonians, although again, probably only a fraction of what the Seleucids are able to collect from their huge far-flung empire, and only a fraction of what the Ptolemies can collect from the wealth and bounty of the Nile. The Macedonians also collect direct taxes from their Macedonian population and rely on customs dues. In fact, we hear from a source at Pseudo-Aristotle, Oikonomika, that suggests that in the late 4th century, this is probably Cassander, but Macedonian kings really increased the amount of customs revenue that they are able to extract for goods coming into Macedonia. So we've got sort of direct and indirect taxation of Macedonia. And then the kings are likely extracting, although in different ways, resources from the areas that they have hegemony. In some instances, that can also mean natural resources, say from the kind of highlands of Ionia and Illyria. In some instances, it may be direct extraction. So, for example, in Greece, we know that the Macedonians are shaking down communities where they have garrisons. For example, they're getting paid. The island of Euboea, where there's a huge Macedonian garrison at Chalkis, is giving just silver to the Macedonians, probably largely to support the garrison. And that is quite likely happening elsewhere. So again, they are extracting resources in different ways. In some instances, it may be sort of foros. In some ways, it may be kind of collections to support garrisons. In some ways, it may be kind of irregular collections. But they are deriving resources also from the parts of Greece and also areas in the northern Balkans that Macedonian kings are able to exert control over. That control can wax and wane with the strength of the Macedonian king. That being said, over the city-states of Greece, much of what the Macedonians exert is hegemony. That is, they may not be directly ruling, city-states in southern Greece, but the Macedonians have military superiority, largely thanks to their control of those key garrisons we talked about earlier. But it's worth talking about them again. They're so critically important for the geopolitics of the period, and those are the fetters of Greece. The Acrocorinth, controlling passage goods traveling through the Isthmus of Corinth, the Chalkis, controlling goods moving up the kind of Euboic Straits, and Demetrius, which controls the Bay of Volos in Thessaly, a really kind of important strategic and commercial bay. So big garrisons in those three areas allow the Macedonians to control a lot of both land and sea traffic moving around Greece. Also, for a while, it's eventually withdrawn in 229, but the Macedonians maintain a garrison in the Athenian port of the Piraeus. And that, of course, is, the Piraeus is also a really, really important sort of node of connectivity. So but there's Macedonian soldiers there for much of the 3rd century BC. And that's, of course, really going to infringe on the practical autonomy of the Athenians, the fact that the Macedonians can always just kind of choke them off from their port. Even if the Athenians are technically autonomous, that's a real drag, shall we say. So that's going to be how the Macedonians exert hegemony through these garrisons. Of course, there's other smaller garrisons in other parts of Greece as well. So that military presence gives the Macedonians, again, establishes their hegemonic control. Still, the regions that the Macedonians control, which in terms of direct control include Thessaly, big chunks of Thrace, and then again a kind of penumbra around the Balkans, around Macedonia proper, full of peoples like the Paeonians and Illyrians. And again, that control sometimes there's campaigns that extend that control, sometimes it contracts, but nonetheless there are peoples who are Thracian, Celtic, Illyrian, Paeonian, who are directly administered by Macedonian agents, in addition to the Kingdom of Macedonia itself. Now, in the Kingdom of Macedonia, the Macedonians do have an army assembly that, in theory, acclaims new Macedonian kings. That doesn't mean that Macedonia is a democracy by any regards. There's no evidence to suggest that this assembly does anything more than play a kind of ceremonial role. That being said, Macedonia itself is has cities like Amphipolis, cities like Pella. And these cities do have civic structures that somewhat mirror the kind of city structures that you would find in a Greek city. And of course, these cities are fully under kind of Macedonian rule. But this is an example of how Macedonian kings actually use cities within Macedonia to exert those governance, their governance, because the cities in governing themselves are useful nodes for the Macedonian king to interact with his own people. Now, the Macedonian army, and this is, this goes back to what we talked about when we talked about Philip II, remains a citizen militia manned by Macedonian citizens. The core of the army is still the citizen pike phalanx, so fighting a dense array of pikes, roughly 16 to 32 men deep, oftentimes a quite tightly packed formation. The size of that militia muster is going to vary, but at its peak, it seems the Macedonians can muster at most about 16 to 20,000 men in their pike phalanx. They also have a kind of special elite unit, men who fight as pikemen, but maybe both kind of younger and wealthier, and therefore seen as capable of more advanced tactics. And those are the peltastae. Again, these are not the peltasts of the kind of 4th century, a type of Greek light infantry. These are basically sort of lean Macedonian pikemen. They have a somewhat smaller shield that makes them a little more maneuverable. But they're still fighting with a kind of Macedonian round shield and a sarissa. The sarissa possibly is perhaps slightly smaller. And usually in big set-piece battles, the peltasts fight next to the main phalanx on the right being kind of the place of honor in ancient battles. So we kind of have our main militia infantry, we have our slightly more prestigious kind of lean pike infantry, the peltasts, and then we have several regiments of cavalry, royal squadrons, the companions, a sacred squadron, and these regiments may be somewhat standing, or at least may be somewhat fixed. And presumably have their own kind of internal hierarchy. So that's the kind of Macedonian citizen army. What's notable is these guys are not full-time professional soldiers. We know when Macedonian kings are campaigning, they will frequently send their army home for the winter. It also seems that so the levy is conducted by district. So there's 4 big administrative districts in Macedonia. Oftentimes one whole district will be levied. But when possible, there's some evidence that Macedonian kings only try to levy districts 1 year. They get 1 year and then they have 1 year off. So they might levy 3 districts 1 year and then only the last district the next year. The goal being that they're not keeping soldiers under continuous service. They want these guys to be able to go back home to their estates, to their farms. We have an emergency levy regulation that comes from the Second Macedonian War with the Romans, but probably reflects general Macedonian practice. It says that in a time when they need the Macedonians need every man they can get, each estate only needs to send 1 man. So each oikos, each household, each estate owes a soldier. But there's a really there's this kind of calculus in the inscription of how old the soldier will be, if there's a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old and a 55-year-old, who will go? And the goal is to always kind of maximize the man being not too young or not too old. But there's also a goal of always keeping at least 1 person on the estate. So even in a kind of emergency military crisis, the Macedonians acknowledge that kind of each oikos needs at least 1 able-bodied man, even if he's older or even if he's say 16, 17, to stay on the farm and help farm it, while 1 able-bodied man, either a father or son, comes off to serve in the Macedonian army. So again, it's definitely a citizens militia, although one that still fights quite regularly, and as a result is a pretty good citizens' militia. So that is the Macedonian army. Of course, in addition to this core of Macedonian citizens and the phalanx, the peltas, these regiments of heavy cavalry, we also see mercenaries being hired from wherever they can hire mercenaries, and also subject troops, that is, troops from like Illyrians or Celts or Thracians or Pannonians, people who fall under Macedonian control, even if they're outside the kind of core of ethnic Macedonians. These also provide contingents to the Macedonian army. So that is the sort of military force. Now, Macedonian kings do have a court and court intrigue, much like the Seleucids or, as we will see, the Ptolemies. One thing that is notable about this court is it does seem to be somewhat less splendid in the kind of courtly expenditures. That is, the Ptolemies, as we'll see, spent tons and tons of money on royal display, whether it's lavish processions or extravagant kind of intellectual infrastructures like the Library of Alexandria. The Seleucids will do the same. Again, whether it's big parties or lavish processions. The Seleucids actually also have a nice library in Antioch, not as big as Alexandria, but they've got one. And the Macedonians seem a little lower key on their kind of court expenditures. They certainly drink and party, and there's plenty of evidence that, like many Macedonian kings, say Philip V is a bit of a drunk, but we don't see the same level of kind of ostentatious display, or even the kind of big infrastructures. Like there's not really a big library. There is a person, the king has his own personal royal library, but there's not a kind of big public structure like there is in Alexandria. And that may be simply that the Macedonians just, A, they don't have that money to spend, but B, they don't need to. They've got, again, greater legitimacy as ethnic kings, and they don't necessarily have to be dumping money out to sort of proclaim their wealth and power the way Seleucids and especially Ptolemaic kings feel like they need to do. At any rate, in terms of the kind of big international situation, the Antigonid kings are routinely friendly with the Seleucid kings. That, in some ways, that kind of goes way back to the old marriage alliance between Demetrius Polyarchides, his daughter Stratonike, and both Seleucus I and Antiochus I. The Antigonids and the Seleucids are on good, quite cordial in their relations. That is, the Antigonids and the Ptolemies have a long tradition of hostility. We'll actually see that tradition of hostility as we do a kind of blow by blow later this week. A lot of that has to do with overlapping claims to the Aegean, since the Ptolemies, while they're based in Egypt, claim Aegean islands and also claim Aegean coastline as far north as Thrace. Thrace being an area that the Antigonid kings frequently want to assert their control over. We will oftentimes see, as the Antigonids confront city-states and regional powers, that the Ptolemies will do their most to support enemies of Macedonia in Greece, whether it's Athens or Sparta or the Achaean League or the Aetolian League. It's not uncommon for them to be getting some funding from the Ptolemaic dynasty. So that's kind of our basic setup. And of course, that's a sort of kind of balance of power. The Seleucids hate the Ptolemies, the Antigonids hate the Ptolemies, but the Seleucids and the Antigonids are by and large friendly in their relationship. Anyway, that's just kind of a broad overview of the Antigonid kingdom. What we'll do next time is look at actually kind of just the narrative, starting with the reign of probably the most important and successful king, namely Antigonus Gonatas, perhaps Antigonus the Knock-Kneed. So we'll talk soon.